Hello, and welcome to another edition of Close Mode, the Enterprise Sales Show. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong. And today I'm really lucky to be with Dan Jiao, Dan is the VP of RevOps at Signified. And if you're not familiar with them, Signified's pretty cool. They leverage big data, machine learning, and manual review to provide a financial guarantee against fraud for e-commerce companies. So, Dan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brian.
So, week or so ago, we were chatting generally about RevOps and how it's relatively sort of new in early stages of its life cycle. And I agreed with you on that and thought, hey, we should probably have a RevOps channel on the podcast for sure. But that being said, I have some questions for you for those who are maybe early in their RevOps career to kind of chat a little bit about that. So what do you think? What are the business drivers that did drive the need for this function? How did it evolve? How did it come about?
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. I know the topics typically span like enterprise sales and go-to-market motions, which I myself actually came from a enterprise sales background prior to moving into revenue operations, so definitely close to my heart there. But I like the question about what drives RevOps. What are some of the business drivers that have really caused a lot of organizations to adopt this as a key function in how they sell their products, retain their customers, and renew them? Well, what I typically have seen is that the most common business driver for organizations to have revenue operations as a function built out is the natural silos that almost every business experiences across its people, processes, data, and tools. And these silos typically cause what I would call a disjointed customer journey and experience, which ultimately hurts revenue and profits and all the other key business metrics that you might look at. And if you take a step back first at defining what revenue operations or RevOps for short really is,
Yes.
it's not always really clear, right? I think a lot of people have mistaken it as like sales operations or sales ops rebranded, but it's far from that. It's very much looking at the whole customer journey. And that focus on RevOps, its mission, its purpose is really on being able to unify all the primary go-to-market functions, sales, marketing, customer success, to essentially row in the same direction, right? Be unified to have better streamlined processes, handoff points between, let's say, marketing and sales and CS, to all function in that direction of moving the needle on the revenue or the revenue metrics that really matter. So I see RevOps really then kind of coming about from this key business driver of silos and disjointed customer experience to help in a few practical ways across removing those silos that I mentioned with people, data, processes, and tools.
Yeah.
And I'll give some examples because I think people always ask the question of okay, cool, we have these silos, we have some revenue problems and leakage. What does RevOps really do to help fix that, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's been a few ways that I've seen this, both when I was a sales leader working with RevOps people to somebody who's evolved his career and pivoted to moving to the RevOps kind of leadership position that I'm in today at Signified. One example is if you have a demand generation problem, which I think a lot of people typically do in B2B technology, RevOps' job is really to be the architect to help the marketing and partnerships and business development teams with architecting how that demand generation engine might need to evolve with lead scoring, lead routing, and the follow-up processes, and then ensure that that engine has a feedback loop between the marketing and sales teams. So you might need to establish a new lead scoring model to look at high intent signals and high fit leads that only those route to the sales team, and vice versa. You have to ensure the sales team has a feedback loop to be able to tell the marketers, hey, this was a really good lead from this source, and here's why. And here was a lead that didn't convert and why we disqualified it. And that's important to be able to refine the campaign engine, right? Like what campaigns worked and didn't. Another really good example I'd say now is RevOps really leads the way on carving out and defining the ideal customer profile or ICP accounts based on what your best customers look like. So this is kind of bridging the gap between the post-sales customer success world and pre-sales, like marketing and sales, by looking at, hey, what are the attributes of our best customers that we onboard, that have higher net retention and renewal rates with us, that find the value of our product and become our future advocates, essentially the people who speak with us at events, they become our references for customers and also like refer business to us. Once you're able to define those attributes, you can essentially carve out your ICP accounts and then build one-to-one and one-to-few ABM plays for the marketing team, as well as ensure that the right accounts are staffed with the right salespeople, like PDRs and AEs. So you're putting the right people in front of the right accounts. And ultimately, that allows you to continue this flywheel of ensuring, hey, you've got the right customer accounts that we know are good, and those are the right prospects we go after. And you continue to fill the funnel and onboard only good customers, right? And that solves the net retention problem, that increases the customer
Hmm.
experience and improves that journey overall. So those are just a couple examples of where RevOps comes in to remove those silos.
I have that's fascinating to me, and I have a couple sort of pop up questions for you. It's funny. Years ago, a teammate of mine and I wrote an article about what we called revenue chain management, and what we were doing is looking at supply chain management. Came about by Booz Allen in the '80s, and they said what they were doing is there's all these disparate parts of an organization that were buying stuff, and it was
Yeah.
impacting customer value at some place. And it's interesting because we started thinking about, well, that's kind of similar on the sales side, which is why we sort of tongue in cheek, but really did mean it. The need for revenue chain management function, all the disparate pieces that were impacting the revenue chain. And yeah, it's interesting because it kind of sounds like RevOps is that revenue chain management. Do you think that's a fair metaphor?
Yeah, I love that metaphor. I like thinking about the revenue operations team as being like the conductor of the orchestra, the revenue
Yeah, yeah,
orchestra in a lot of
yep,
ways. But I like what you're saying too, the revenue chain management piece. I actually recently read the book The Goal by Ellie Goldratt, and
okay,
that was all about essentially how it's about a manufacturing plant, but it honestly translates so well to like the B2B technology space as well, with how you need to focus on like driving all the components of a plant or an organization towards the same goal of driving revenue, driving
yep.
profit, and ensuring that you don't get too into the minutia of local optimization. So
You,
like you don't want to just optimize the sales team to keep booking deals if all those deals end up never going live, or they all just end up being churns, or
yeah,
essentially just a bad situation overall for the business and a bad buyer experience too. So totally, like
yeah.
RevOps should be looking at those silos or those process gaps and fixing that for the whole system.
I was giving a talk a couple of weeks ago, and this is from a lot of interviews on the show. A lot of sales leaders, revenue leaders have said to me, we used to enjoy five to six X of pipe, right, to goal. And they're saying in 23, 24, we're looking at sort of 2X. And then Jim Dickey, who I often quote, is an advisor to us and an industry analyst. Jim said, look, in 2024, it's going to be less about top of the funnel and more about closing what's in your funnel, especially if you only have 2X. I'm wondering, one, how you feel about that in general. And two, I'm really curious about what's the RevOps role. If that is, in addition to still continuing to fill it, we've got to get a higher percentage of what's in there. So do you agree with that notion of where we're at and pipe, and what is the role of RevOps in converting more in 2024?
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I think more and more now, there's a lot more consolidation happening across the industry for especially technology solutions, right? There's increased scrutiny on everyone's financials because there's been market trends on increased interest rates to combat inflation. That means
Yep.
that investors have had other places they can park their money. They're not parking it maybe in certain risky bets, and then
Yep.
the companies in their portfolio have had to essentially increase their cash flows and become more profitable, right? It's less
Yeah.
a little bit about that 30% year over year growth. I think a lot of boards of directors would be willing to trade 30% year over year top line revenue growth for 10 to 20% while maintaining a path towards profitability.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of, especially in tech, a lot of tech companies sell to other tech companies. That's why you're seeing a lot less companies that are qualified pipeline, right? That's why instead of 5 to 6x pipeline coverage to target, it's probably only 2x.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised by that. And you kind of
Yep.
see that too with revenue operations teams that buy different revenue execution solutions or platforms, that there's more scrutiny there. So I'm sure that's the case. I love
Yep.
your question about, hey, how does RevOps help not just with top of funnel? And I think I gave two examples there originally
Yes.
about SB account identification and demand generation engines around lead models.
Yes.
But the key part for RevOps too is helping with converting opportunities as well, right? So recently here at Signified, we helped in a couple of ways, right? There was one was being able to define our sales process very clearly on like what is the stage definition, partnering with the sales leadership team on identifying what clear exit criteria would be. So before you can go to stage 0 to stage 1, like what are some of the things you need to do, right?
Yeah.
But then being able to also essentially evaluate that process and see how it's going is also a critical part of how RevOps helps with that conversion piece, right? We have a lot of data in our ecosystem today to be able to inform us on what deals are likely to convert and which deals are unlikely to convert, right? So there's some risk signals that RevOps can surface and insights to help the sales leadership team prioritize which deals might not be multi-threaded enough or which deals need to have better access to power, right? Like, and then if we're engaging the right buyer personas, right, we have all this data to tell us like which buyer personas and job levels of our opportunity contacts that the buying committees we've engaged are actually likely to help us convert. So there's a lot of that kind of insights that help with that conversion piece, right? Because converting is harder than ever, right? We've
Yeah.
seen data that like you have a way higher chance. I think almost like double the chance of winning a deal if you go from single threaded, like maybe one or two folks that you're talking to 4 to 5 people in the buying committee.
Yes.
So I think that's
Yeah.
just one of the ways that RevOps helps with converting.
Cool. You made a point a couple of minutes ago about the ideal customer profile, and it's interesting because I was mentioning this Strategic Account Management Association. I was speaking at the conference, and a gentleman come up to me after, and we were chatting, and he made to me, like, we all know ICP is important, but he tied it to renewal, which immediately made sense. He talked about an opportunity. He was with a relatively small tech company, and he said the moment we signed these guys, they weren't buying from us in the right way that we could drive the greatest amount of value. Like, we weren't engaged with them at maybe multi-threaded, as you said. And he said, lo and behold, here we are at renewal, and they're not going to renew. And he said, I could have told you that. And it was interesting to me. It's the first time someone actually made that connection from one end all the way to the other end to renewal. And it just sort of exploded in my brain to go, wow, it's like I always think of about ICP as conversion, what's going to convert at a higher rate than somebody else. But you made me think of that when you brought it up earlier, that it is tied to renewal and a real leading indicator of renewal.
Yeah, I like to tie to like net retention too. Like if you're a growth
Yeah.
company, it's not just who's going to renew with you, but which customer you're going to sign, who's going to grow with you.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So what do you think, if we kind of jump up to a macro level, did the function of RevOps, was it driven by kind of macro shifts in the market? What changed where the old model was no longer working, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think revenue operations has been around for a while. It's definitely become more popularized
Yeah.
because there's more and more pressure on organizations to grow profitably and efficiently, right? I've seen some articles about this term like profitable, efficient growth. That's been a very hot buzzword in the kind
Okay.
of the go-to-market community. And even though RevOps is around for even since the early 2000s, I think it picked up steam a lot in the last 10 years and
That's
especially
fair.
in the
Yeah.
last few years from post pandemic, right? Where
Yeah.
money wasn't as free and people had to think very thoughtfully about how they were going to scale their organization from maybe a 20 to $50 million venture to the 100 million plus or even 500 million plus journey. So I think that macro trend of like profitable efficient growth has led to RevOps becoming more well adopted. And also just naturally, you're seeing like people wanting to cost consolidate. And one of the initial benefits of RevOps is, hey, if you've got a siloed marketing ops, sales ops, and CS ops team, and maybe a Salesforce or tools team, it always makes sense to bring them under one umbrella because you do get some natural cost savings. You reduce a lot of the kind of duplicitous tools and processes and data bloat that was happening between those teams, and you get some immediate benefits there. So I think a lot of C-level and executive teams have realized that this is a really powerful function, especially for your revenue engine or your go-to-market teams.
You mentioned to me in an earlier conversation that DevOps has to solve the data problem. And it's interesting because after you said that, Dan, I was thinking, like, we're swimming in data. So is the data problem there's too much, or there's not enough, or not the right? There's so many ways to define the data problem. So I'm really curious from your role, what is the data problem?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I definitely think there's too much data, but too much data can also be made a strategic advantage for your organization, right? I had a previous CEO of mine say that you have to find the signal and cut through the noise, right? Signal to noise ratio, in this case, is what he's referring to. And a lot of the data we have is noise. And I think it's RevOps' job to be able to cut through that noise and figure out the data that really matters to provide insights, to help us like operate more effectively, right? Like a lot of that data is really critical for things like I've already mentioned, like ICP definition, but it can also be useful for identifying risky deals. Another example I gave about like how DevOps can help prioritize and identify those deals that might need more cross-functional resourcing in order to win. And then the other things I think about with data and being able to solve that problem is it's almost critical to any process kickoff or any like automation that the business needs to run smoothly. And I think about automation as something that helps the go to market teams, whether it's a marketer trying to run a campaign or a sales rep trying to do outbound prospecting or selling, or the CSM who's just trying to manage their daily book of business for renewals and mitigate churns and do upsells. Automation to kick that off is all relying on data. So I give you an example of why that matters. Let's just say that you need really good renewals data to be able to trigger like a opportunity in Salesforce being open to um, track an upcoming renewal, right? Especially for more mid-market or SMB CSMs, they might have a book of business that is 20 plus accounts. Maybe some of them are managing hundreds of accounts that they have to just react to and figure out how to prioritize their time on who do I have to spend time with to renew
Yeah.
or essentially resolve and mitigate from churn. So if you have really good data on usage on the customer, you know exactly what contract details we have in terms of like when they need to renew. You can build automation to trigger the Salesforce opportunity for renewal. You can put those in front of the CSM in this case to prioritize, and then that helps with the problem of like net retention, renewals, current customer revenue. And I think a lot of people have focused a lot of their time, especially in RevOps, because as a revenue engine like orchestra like conductor,
Yeah.
you're thinking about like, hey, what's really mattering in the business right now? And a lot of the times it's more expensive to acquire a new logo customer than just take your current customers and kind of defend your turf and grow your turf, right?
Yeah.
So I think that has been really critical, and you have to get the data right. So a lot of work on my team, for example, is focused on how do we instrument the data to make sure it's available, and how do we ensure there's processes in place and controls to ensure that data stays clean. Because if we don't have clean renewal date data, then that whole process I just described to you
Yeah.
breaks down completely.
Yeah. So it's funny. I mentioned to you as we were getting ready for today's show that I'm really looking forward to talking to you because personally I have so many questions that I'm really interested in your answer. And one is, in my past business, we did a lot of human deal coaching, and then in my new business, we do AI enabled coaching. But my question, and I want your honest answer, like where do we see some data that suggests that really high level human deal coaching makes an impact on win rate? And I'm just wondering, with all the data and the analytics and tools, like how it lands in your RevOps mind about the role a really good frontline sales manager coach plays in conversion.
Oh, it's absolutely critical, right? I think you mentioned the problem of not having enough pipe, like only 2x coverage. And I think that really puts a spotlight on what you have. And it's really hard nowadays to get that first initial discovery call.
Yeah.
Um, Something we've been working on at Signified is figuring out like how do we
Mm.
operationalize and enable our frontline managers to be effective and consistent with coaching new sales reps as well as the tenured
Yeah.
veterans that we have on the team as well to be effective in that first call, because oftentimes it's not very as hard to like convert that inbound who knows they have the pain, they're educated, they might
Right.
know what your solution already does. It's actually a lot harder to have that outbound meeting because usually that person is not expecting to buy your company's products or services, and then help be a thought leader to them. And I think a lot of that comes with the frontline manager being able to give like high level coaching on how they can make the sales conversation a conversation on industry trends, pain points, and make it very educational and informative rather than a hard pitch of like, hey, okay, I'm going to show you my deck of like what we do, and then let's see if, yes, no, does this resonate with you? And if so, like I'll send you the slide deck, and hope that converts to like a qualified opportunity.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, it usually doesn't, right? So
Yeah. Well, it's funny too because it's another one of these questions I have for you that's like it's sort of self curiosity. So back to this. All right, yeah, we've got someone who's got some pain in somewhere, and maybe I need to fix this pain. Like I get that, and for my own business, when I find those, it's like wow, that okay, that's hot. Let's go after it. This thing about like talking to new people and creating pain. A lot of folks talk about that. I'm just wondering what your perspective on is on like the sales life cycle of example A versus example B. What's your experience on B? Like how difficult, how long, what's the probability those get converted, that kind of thing.
yeah. I think for those, you have to look at a few things. Something we've been starting to invest in here at Signified is a set of tools that allow us to predict the interaction effectiveness of that first conversation,
Yeah,
and then also track the data of like the outcomes, right? Like of hey, positive interactions, does that lead to better conversion to
yeah,
stage one or stage two opportunities?
yeah.
Um, I think that's how you kind of figure out if example B is something that you can convert better, because those are kind of those painful initial discovery calls that happen, but maybe
Yeah.
aren't leading to the revenue outcomes that you want right away.
Right.
So there's tools. I mean, that's one great part about RevOps is you do own the tools and tech stack infrastructure for the revenue team. So
Yeah.
for example, if there's conversational intelligence or even tools like CloseStrong, like the new generative AI applications that
Right.
help with that first meeting conversion, those are just some of the ways that I see getting better at the example B scenarios where
Right.
you're trying to really outbound to the customer and get them to understand that they have a pain point, realize that they have a pain point, and then continue on in a evaluation process.
Yeah, I appreciate that. As I say, it was a personal question because it's even more personally frustrating to go, are we better off really hunting for those who are in some stage of pain versus trying to convert? And quite frankly, I've been trying to answer that question for years. And the reality is we do both for sure. But it's just there's such a bias in my mind toward let's look even harder for those that are in some notion of pain, creating pain. I find even with the best methodologies, the best approaches, the best technology is quite tricky. So that's why I ask. Um, so when, what do you think my last question for you has to do with someone who may not have a RevOps function. And I think you clarified this notion that RevOps isn't new. It's just sort of expanding at a faster rate. And I think it's a much better way to think about it. When do you know it's time to expand and put what sort of pain are you seeing frontline that says, oh, we might need this function to solve this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think a lot of organizations have already caught on, like I mentioned. I think I remember reading on LinkedIn that they reported that RevOps was a job title that had grown 300% year over year. So it's definitely one of those hot career paths
Wow.
right now.
Yeah.
And actually, naturally, I think many chief revenue officers or CROs have been hiring the heads of RevOps or VP, SVP of RevOps as their right hand person slash kind of chief of staff. So
Okay.
when they enter a new organization, they kind of need like a person to come on. That's usually when we've seen a lot of heads of RevOps get introduced. And actually, I've seen recently certain larger technology companies hire on CROs and VPs of RevOps as a package deal almost. Like they come
Interesting.
together. Yeah. But I like your question there, Brian, about when does a company know when to formally establish? Personally, for me, I'm a little bit biased, but I think a company should establish a RevOps function before they see the problems that typically RevOps is brought in
Ah,
to fix, right? Usually the revenue leakage and silos problem that we talked about. I think it's actually a little bit too late by that point because you probably already have a bunch of tech debt and the RevOps team is firefighting more than being a strategic partner to the go-to-market leaders. So as early as possible makes a lot of
yeah,
sense.
it's so funny. You just summed it up. I just had fire prevention and firefighting in my head. So you're totally right. That the time is fire prevention. It's a great answer. Given everything we've talked about, it makes complete sense. Yeah, you've been super generous with your time and your ideas and added to the community. And I do think we need a RevOps channel. And we've tried to, for those who are listening, Dan, our producer, has categorized a lot of the 60 plus podcast into categories. So, if you're thinking about RevOps or sales methodology or forecasting, and you want to hear what 5 or 6 of your peers are saying on the subject, and if you want to hear Dan is saying about RevOps, he'll be sitting in the RevOps category. So thank you so much for your time. It's really, really appreciated.
Yeah, appreciate being on the podcast. Thanks for having me.